Okay, here we are, part 4. We're into tier 7. And with tier 7, we begin Sedevacantism. And something that I've kind of said before in a lot of these videos is that the way that I organize this chart, this goes from the most mainstream sensibilities, the cultural Catholic, to the normal Catholic, to the traditionalist, to the more rabid or radical traditionalist criticism of Vatican II in the modern church, to increasingly more extreme criticisms of Vatican II in the modern Catholic Church. First up, starting off tier 7, we have Sedevacantism. And now, I've said Sedevacantism or Sedevacantist views multiple times prior to this, but now we talk about Sedevacantism in and of itself. So Sedevacantism is a traditionalist Catholic movement that says either since the death of Pius XII or sometimes John the 23rd that there has been no true pope since then, and basically the seat of St. Peter is vacant. Thus comes the name Sedevacantism, or vacant seat in Latin. And so all the popes that have come since Vatican II are anti-popes because either of heresy or because they try to impose heresy on the church. And the imposition is Vatican II and the new Mass, and so that has made them into anti-popes who are not true popes, and that they've in fact fooled the world into thinking that they're true popes, and that they're the Catholic Church, the universal church, the one true Church of Christ, is now a very small remnant of what it once was. Next up, we have the Society of St. Pius V. The Society of St. Pius V is a traditionalist Catholic society of Catholic priests, which broke off from the Society of St. Pius X in 1983 because they didn't want to follow the Missal of 1962 and wanted to keep to the Missal of 1954. The Society of St. Pius V is widely seen as a Sedevacantist group, but the reality is that they're arguably Sedevadoutist, which is an interesting topic, and we'll get to that deeper here in the Iceberg. The una cum controversy. So una cum means with the bishop or with the pope. It's in union, it means in Latin. So this is where in the Mass you say with our bishop and with our Pope Francis, right? And so this is one of the main controversies within Sedevacantism. All Sedevacantists do not put una cum for the Pope into the Mass when they serve it, but some Sedevacantists believe it's okay for Sedevacantists to go to what they view as valid Latin Mass done by traditional priests that are not in communion with Francis. So some Sedevacantists believe it's okay to go to independent traditionalist Catholic priests, like the Society of St. Pius X, or the society, or the various resistance societies of St. Pius X. And it's okay to go there even if they're not Sedevacantists because they're traditionalist and they're not in full communion, you could say, with Pope Francis. Others think that the mere view that it's okay for the laity to go to the St. Pius X Masses is a very grievous scandal itself, and says that you should not attend the Mass of somebody that says that it's even possible to go to a Society of St. Pius X Mass in good standing. For some background, this split has to do with the CMRI believing that it's okay to go to a Society of St. Pius X Mass if you're a Sedevacantist, and then just not talk about it with the priest and not bring up waves. You can just go there and do it as part of your Sunday obligation. Bishop Sanborn and many of the priests that follow him in the Roman Catholic Institute believe that you can't even go to a priest that believes that you could go to a Society of St. Pius X Church and receive communion there. Next up, we have the Siri hypothesis. The Siri hypothesis connects to the 1958 conclave irregularities, the idea that there was white smoke that elected a pope before John the 23rd, and it's usually said that Cardinal Giuseppe Siri was that pope, and that he would have led the church into a much more traditionalist direction. It's kind of an odd version of Sedevacantism because it kind of says that there was a pope this whole time, he was just in hiding, or he didn't have the courage or conviction to step out, or that he was like, it was covered up that he was a true pope or something like that. It's kind of odd, and usually it goes something like, Siri was elected pope in 1958, the Soviet Union or a Jewish conspiracy or a Freemason conspiracy said that they would nuke the Vatican if he came out and became the pope. And so they had to choose John the 23rd in his place. And then Siri, who would have been, I believe, it's usually said he's supposed to be Gregory the 17th. He was held hostage by these, I don't know, Jews or Freemasons or communists. And so he wasn't able to ever get out and say that he was a true pope. But this whole time he was the Archbishop of Genoa. And so he was the Archbishop of Genoa until 1987. It's an interesting, very fringe theory. I don't know what basis they usually point to. There's all these ideas that there's like these declassified documents that say that he was really the Pope of the whole time by the CIA and stuff like that. It's just kind of odd. Next up we have the CMRI, or the Congregation of Mary the Immaculate Queen. The CMRI is probably the most populous or the most largest of the various Sedevacantist traditionalist Catholic congregations or orders of priests. They're dedicated to Our Lady Fatima and devotion to the practice of total consecration to the Virgin Mary. So they've been Sedevacantists. They say that the Pope or the papacy has been empty since 1958. Pius XII was the last Pope. They're pretty big. They're mostly throughout the United States and Canada, but they're starting to spread into other regions of the earth. They're known as the Mount St. Michael group because their stronghold is, I guess their base of operations, maybe that'd be a better way to say it, is Mount St. Michael, which was a former seminary run by the Jesuits that the CMRI bought up when they started. So the CMRI is one of the first Sedevacantist groups. The original founder was a man named Francis Schuckart, or Schuckart. He had a lot of health problems. He was in a wheelchair, but he was very eccentric. He ended up getting old Catholic orders and ordained a lot of people in those old Catholic orders. He ended up being accused of pederasty and homosexual acts, and so he was kicked out of the CMRI in 1984. A lot of people considered the CMRI at this time to be kind of a cult, and that they're run around by Schuckart and his cult of personality at that time. Schuckart went his own way, and he had loyalists that followed him that we'll talk about deeper into this Iceberg. Eventually, though, they would be reordained in Archbishop Thuc's orders. And I'm going to say his name wrong. Bishop Mark Peverunis is now the default leader. I think he's the leader. It's kind of interesting within a lot of these CMRI or the Society of St. Pius X or Society of St. Pius V and a lot of these groups, because bishops aren't necessarily the leaders. They have the holy orders, but sometimes they'll have superior generals that aren't bishops, and then you'll have bishops go back and forth. And that's the case with the CMRI. Is Mark Feberunis, I know I'm saying it wrong somehow. There was a period where Kashmir Pistorius was superior general, and then Mark Perverunis became superior general again. But anyway, he's a bishop that was consecrated by the Sedevacantist bishop Mose Camarona. He was a Mexican Sedevacantist. He died tragically in a car accident. Anyway, so a lot of Sedevacantist orders actually come through the CMRI. They're rapidly growing. They're the largest Sedevacantist order. They're not seen as a cult anymore because they kind of cleared out a lot of their corruption that surrounded Bishop Schuckart. And because they have that backstory of Bishop Schuckart's controversies and some other controversies of alleged child abuse that are supposed to have occurred at their school, which I don't know if they really happened. They're seen as much more open and lenient and measured than other Sedevacantist groups, and this kind of goes into, like I said before, with the whole una cum controversy. I already talked about one of these with the whole una cum controversy, but basically the CMRI thinks that it's fine for Sedevacantists to go to other societies and receive communion from them. So say the Society of St. Pius X or the Society of St. Pius V, when those other societies don't necessarily commune with the CMRI. The CMRI are kind of seen as the more level-shouldered amongst Sedevacantist groups, ironically. Sedeprivationism. Sedeprivationism is an interesting theory, and I would say a form of Sedevacantism. It's the idea that the popes since Vatican II are validly elected popes, but they don't have the authority to teach and govern the body of the church as the popes because they accept the Second Vatican Council and they have the intention to promulgate errors over the mass of the faithful. So basically, the doctrine asserts that since the council, the occupants of the See of Peter are popes materially but not formally, as such, Sedeprivationists teach that John the 23rd through Pope Francis have not attained the fullness of the papacy, but if they were to repent, then they would actually become true popes. This is known as the thesis of Cassicaium, and it owes its origin to Bishop Gerard de Laurier, who is a French bishop who ended up being consecrated a bishop by Archbishop Thuc. It is popularized again by Bishop Sanborn, who runs a pretty prominent Sedevacantist seminary, Most Holy Trinity Seminary, and he runs the Roman Catholic Institute. Next up, we have the Novus Ordo banned traditional rites of various holy orders. So after Vatican II, the leaders of a lot of holy orders believed that to keep in track with Vatican II, they needed to abandon their traditional rites they would do. I don't know if a lot of people know this, but a lot of holy orders and monastic communities have their own liturgical traditions. And so in the wake of Vatican II, a lot of these traditions were kind of thrown out the window and they were stopped being done. And a lot of monks and religious orders ended up doing the Novus Ordo. Sometimes they received communion on the hand and did other things that we would see as liturgical abuses in the wake of the release of the Novus Ordo and in the 1970s. And as time has gone on, a lot of monastic orders have broken off of the bigger orders and they've kind of refounded themselves and do the traditional rites of their orders of priests. Next up, we have the Divine Mercy Chaplet is heretical. A lot of, I could say, more aggressive trads believe that the Divine Mercy Chaplet is heretical and that its view of grace and how much grace it gives people is heretical and kind of undermines the Catholic view of penance. Next up, we have, in quotations, the post-Vatican II church is Gnostic. So there's kind of two ways you could say this. You could say that the Vatican II church teaches some kind of higher Gnostic knowledge over traditional Catholicism, or you could say that the way that the Catholic Church operates is that most people think that the Catholic Church today is at the top of the iceberg, and that the real faithful have some kind of Gnostic or hidden version of Christianity, which is traditional Catholicism, and that basically what actually we would call traditional Catholicism or small or Orthodox Catholicism is like Gnosticism. It's not out there at the front, and that you have to be incarnated and learn the secret truths of the religion. And like Novus Ordo Church or Vatican II Church, calling the mainstream Catholic Church Gnostic from a traditionalist point of view is just kind of a talking point or slur or polemic against the modern Catholic Church. The Most Holy Family Monastery. The Most Holy Family Monastery is a Sedevacantist group of monks in upstate New York, in Fillmore, New York, and it's run by Michael and Peter Diamond, commonly known as the Diamond Brothers. Most Holy Family Monastery is probably the most public Sedevacantist group. They have a big YouTube channel where they publish a lot of Catholic content, some of which is, viewable by small or Orthodox Catholics and would help teach them. There's not really anything wrong in them. Some of which would be seen by normal, I guess, run-of-the-mill Sedevacantist and would be seen, as like good, above the board, helps Sedevacantism, helps traditional Catholicism. But they also make a lot of videos about their prophecies and their bizarre readings of the Bible. Just kind of odd stuff because they're always prophesizing the end of the world, and they have kind of more aggressive or more extreme views, a lot of which are just going on throughout this whole chart, or this whole iceberg, you could say. They are Feniites. Feniism and Sedevacantism don't really mix that often because Feniism, really, you have to have a visible church, a visible Catholic church, to say who is in it and who is out of it. And because Sedevacantism's ecclesiology and how visible the church is a lot more amorphous, it would seem that Sedevacantism, at least in my mind, and Feniism don't mix. Of course, most Holy Family Monastery are rabid Feniites and believe that going to most other Sedevacantist groups is in fact sinful because they're not Feniites. They also oppose natural family planning, and they have a whole set of odd beliefs that we'll talk about as we go further down into the iceberg. Next up, we have unbaptized babies go to hell. And so this is actually, from my understanding, a belief of the Most Holy Family Monastery. This is a really extreme belief, and we talked about this through the iceberg as we get from kind of like a more normal belief, what was normal throughout the history of the church, and now we get into the more extreme belief. So I guess most modern people would say that unbaptized babies go to heaven because they didn't commit actual sin. Somehow they would say they would get saved. And then the traditional point of view would have been limbo of the infants, where they go to an earthly paradise because they never had done any actual sins. Well, the Diamond Brothers would just say unbaptized babies, unbaptized toddlers, unbaptized children before the age of reason, they're just damned and they burn in hell forever. So, kind of an interesting theory, kind of extreme, kind of thing that you would see from the Most Holy Family Monastery and the Diamond Brothers. Next up, we have Father Anthony Cicada. Father Cicada was a Sedevacantist priest and prominent author. He wrote the book Work of Human Hands, and he wrote numerous articles defending the Sedevacantist position in numerous ways. He ran a YouTube channel which was pushed Sedevacantism, and it was quite scholarly. And so he's kind of seen as one of the most prominent Sedevacantist theologians. He died recently in 2020 of cancer. Next up, we have the Nine. The Nine, of course, are the original founding members of the Society of St. Pius V. These were the priests that were kicked out, at least on the surface level, because they refused to do the Missal of 1962, instead preferring to do the Missal of 1954. Father Cicada was one of the Nine. Most of the Nine ended up leaving, and only really 3 of them, from my understanding, stayed within the Society of St. Pius X. Even though on the surface they were kicked out because they didn't want to do the Missal of 1962, the reality is that they were kicked out for being Sedevacantists. In a lot of St. Pius X circles, they're given the infamous and arguably kind of metal and awesome name, the Nine. See, on the next entry, I'm just going to mispronounce it, so I'm just going to go with its English name, Institute of the Mother of Good Counsel. This is a Sedeprivationist religious order based in Italy. This is the largest Sedevacantist religious order in Europe. Father Gomar de Paul was a traditional Catholic priest who ran a church, the Ave Maria Chapel, on Long Island. He was the founder of the organization called Catholic Traditionalist Movement. He never became a bishop, he never formally was excommunicated, and he was always incarnated as a priest until his death. He's one of many independent traditionalist Catholic priests that followed the Vatican Council, who offered the Latin Mass. This was kind of the mainstay of traditionalist chapels were traditionalist priests who never probably were ever kicked out of their diocese. They just kind of went their own way and then ended up having independent chapels which weren't really connected under any bishops. Of course, over time, this is kind of dried up as you need a bishop to consecrate, I should not say consecrate, ordain priests. And so over time, this trend is kind of moved towards these traditionalist Catholic religious orders, either the Society of St. Pius X, the various resistant St. Pius X societies, or the various Sedevacantist societies. And the independent traditional Catholic Church has declined. Next up, we have the Novus Ordo, holy orders are invalid. Most Sedevacantists believe that the 1968 holy orders, both the bishop and the priest, order of consecration, order of ordination, are invalid. I don't exactly understand why Paul VI considered it important or why he promulgated new rites of ordination. Of course, if you're in the mainstream Catholic Church, obviously the Pope can do this, but if you don't believe that Paul VI is the Pope, and so on, you would think, well, you have an anti-pope that's giving out new orders of ordination, new orders of episcopal consecration for the Roman Rite. Well, that's pretty dubious. That's pretty questionable. So are these priests, and further down the line, are these bishops real priests and bishops? And most Sedevacantists say no. Now, whether or not their arguments are very good, that's a whole nother kettle of fish. And I'm not really prepared to debate that here. Sorry, Sedis, I'm not really up to that. I'll just admit that. But it is important noting that this is one of the reasons why Sedevacantists are kind of going their own way as time goes on. And they're kind of being seen more and more as a splinter group off from what you could call the main Catholic Church. Because they're saying that the Catholic Church is I guess you could say the mainstream Catholic Church is its own thing, and the Sedevacantists are going off with their own holy orders, they're going off and they're having their own culture that's different, and the two aren't really crossing each other anymore. Because if a regular Catholic Church priest tries to leave the Catholic Church and become a Sedevacantist, he would have to be reordained. And so that's pretty humiliating. So he has to swallow a lot in order to do that. And he may be rejected by a Sedevacantist bishop. So you have to keep that in mind. So it kind of is keeping this wall in between the two. And you can kind of see how they're going off in two different directions as time goes on. And it also acts to prevent Sedevacantist lay people from ever going to, say, the Fraternity of St. Peter or the Institute of Christ the King and receiving communion there, but say keeping Sedevacantist in their minds and just not talking about it with the priest or with the other lay people there. Quotation: the Orthodox feel the same way about Patriarch Bartholomew. So Patriarch Bartholomew is the Patriarch of Constantinople, at least first among equals within the general body of Eastern Orthodoxy. Amongst a lot of, again, small o Orthodox, big O Orthodox, he's seen as a liberal. And so unbeknownst to a lot of Catholics, a lot of traditional Catholics, there is also a parallel world of traditional Orthodoxy, which is not in communion with the general hierarchy of the wider world of Orthodoxy. These are the old calendarist or true Orthodox. And it's very interesting from a sociological point of view or a historian of religion point of view, and to try and compare the traditional Catholic movement and the old calendarist movement. The Fraternity of St. Peter, or the FSSP, never got their bishop. From my understanding, when the Icone consecrations happened and the Society of St. Pius X was excommunicated and the Fraternity of St. Peter was created, the Holy Office and the Vatican promised the Fraternity of St. Peter that they would get a bishop, and that's never actually occurred. Next up, we have Bishop Donald Sanborn. I've talked about Bishop Donald Sanborn before on this chart a bunch of times already. He was one of the members of the Nine. Initially, he was a Society of St. Pius V priest. Around 1995, he ended up leaving the Society of St. Pius V. Before he was kicked out of the Society of St. Pius X in 1983, along with the other 9, he was actually the head of the seminary for the Society of St. Pius X in the United States, the St. Thomas Aquinas Seminary. After he was kicked out of the Society of St. Pius X, he was replaced by the then Father Richard Williamson and eventually Bishop Richard Williamson. After he left the Society of St. Pius V, he would eventually found his own seminary for Sedevacantism, the Most Holy Trinity Seminary, where he teaches Sedeprivationism, a type of Sedevacantism, and he ended up being consecrated a bishop by Bishop Robert McKenna, who was a former Dominican priest and became a prominent Sedevacantist bishop, and he held the Sedeprivationist theory. Bishop Sanborn is well known within traditional Catholic circles for being a charismatic and forceful speaker. He's continued to be the rector of Most Holy Seminary for the past almost 30 years now. Even outside of traditional Catholic circles, he's kind of pushed around as an interesting and forceful speaker. If you go on YouTube, you'll find a lot of his speeches and his sermons. He's generally just really popular within the Sedevacantist community. Next up, we have Archbishop Thuc. The vast majority of Sedevacantist holy orders currently descend from Archbishop Thuc, who was the Archbishop of Hue, Vietnam, prior to Vatican II. He eventually became Sedevacantist, but maybe that's jumping ahead a little bit. He was the head of course, the Archbishop of Hue, Vietnam, one of the largest cities in South Vietnam, and his brother was actually president of South Vietnam, and his brother was assassinated in 1963 while he was at the Second Vatican Council. Because he was at the Second Vatican Council, he was spared from being assassinated himself. Most of his family members who had business connections or connections to his brother in the government were assassinated as well, so he's just kind of left isolated in Europe without any friends, without any allies, and eventually the Vatican would replace him with a different bishop in Hue, according to him, against his wishes. Isolated and without any friends and within a foreign country, and Archbishop Thuc would join the Traditionalist Catholic movement in his exile in the later years of his life. He would end up consecrating several members of various traditional Catholic groups into bishops, including Sedevacantist, Old Catholics trying to become traditional Catholics and get reordained with, more normal orders that are less scandalous outside of the Old Catholic orders. And most infamously, he consecrated laymen. First, he ordained them into priests, then consecrated them into bishops over, I believe, 2 days in the Palmer de Troya group. In the last years before his death, he said that he was a Sedevacantist, therefore being the only bishop who had held a episcopal see who became a public Sedevacantist after Vatican II. But there's a lot of questions regarding his sincerity with that, and the sincerity of a lot of the actions in his later years, because he was in his late 80s, and so there's a lot of controversy surrounding him and surrounding his holy orders. According to public record, he reconciled with the Holy See before he died, but several Sedevacantists disagree with this and say that it's not true. What Catholics believe. What Catholics believe is a public access, I don't know if it's still a public access program, but it's been around for over 30 years. It is a program run by Father William Jenkins of the Society of St. Pius V, and of course, again, going back to this, one of the 9, and he just kind of talks about every week or every few weeks traditional Catholic issues. It's a pretty popular series. It was originally public access, and now it's mainly done on YouTube. Next up, we have The Work of Human Hands. This is the book by Father Shikata. It's his magnum opus. It's about 500 pages, and it is, I believe, the most in-depth criticism of the Novus Ordo Mass, and it details the history of the changes and the nature of the changes between the 1954 Missal and the 1969 Missal. It criticizes the Novus Ordo and says at numerous points that it is pushing forward a different religion than traditional Catholicism in both its text and its celebration. It argues that while somebody could interpret this as valid within the line of trajectory of the history of the liturgy of the West, that's just one way it's conducted, and that the way that the Novus Ordo Mass was made from the beginning is to allow numerous variations in the way of its celebration, which undermines the Catholicity of the Church, the universality of its celebration of its most important sacrament. Now we have the Bishop Williamson line of bishops. So Bishop Williamson, we talked about him a lot, I think, so far. Bishop Williamson, formerly of the Society of St. Pius X, consecrated a bishop by Archbishop Lefebvre, excommunicated in 1988 when that happened as part of the Icone consecrations and the Icone excommunications. He was de-excommunicated while the Society of St. Pius X was trying to become regular, I guess, within the Catholic Church. Later on, he would be kicked out of the Society of St. Pius X, and he would end up consecrating his own episcopal successors within the movement that is known as the Society of St. Pius X Resistance. So far, he has consecrated 5 successors, more than Archbishop Lefebvre had consecrated. And so I guess the question is how many successors is he going to have? He's kind of old, obviously. He's 83. And how prudent will these successors be in consecrating bishops themselves? Obviously, the 3 Sedevacantist bishops that were consecrated by Archbishop Thuc led to a great wave of Sedevacantist clergy throughout the world. And so will these bishops consecrated by Bishop Williamson be just as prolific, and will there be imprudent consecrations? Will these consecrations eventually be seen as dubious, like many of the old Catholic orders, and to a lot of people that took consecrations? I guess only time will tell. Summorum Pontificum lied, and Paul VI banned the Latin Mass. So Summorum Pontificum we talked about a lot already. That's the 2007 change in the indult, which allowed the indult of the Latin Mass to be liberated quite a bit by Benedict XVI. And so in Summorum Pontificum, it talks about how the Latin Mass was never banned. Well, that seems to contradict reality because Paul VI banned it and numerous bishops banned it. Trento, or the Priestly Society of Trent in Latin, I'm going to butcher it, so what's the point? It's a Mexican Sedevacantist society of priests. It's pretty popular in Mexico. The problem is that because it's all the articles about it online are going to be in Spanish, I don't know that much about it. They have Archbishop Thuc orders, originally under Camerana, Moses Camerana. They were Sedevacantists, they had a bishop, and then he died. But before he died, he consecrated Mark Peverunis of the CMRI, and so Mark Peverunis then consecrated the various bishops and ordained priests for Trento. Trento continues now as the primary Sedevacantist order in Mexico. John the 23rd was a Freemason. So this is a common, I guess, conspiracy theory or talking point within Sedevacantism, is to say that John the 23rd was a Freemason. And that's because Sedevacantism has a problem, is that John the 23rd, while he started Vatican II, he didn't really promulgate any of the things that Sedevacantists have issues with, because he died at the beginning of the council, and so Sedevacantists are kind of left up in the air. Was he a true pope? Was he like the worst pope of all time but still a true pope? or was he a heretic and he never was a pope? And it's really difficult to find things you could say that are heresies that John the 23rd did, in the way that Sedevacantists will point to things that Paul VI did, and obviously with Francis it's a lot easier than with John Paul II and Paul VI. But it's a common talking point that John the 23rd was a Freemason, and since he was a Freemason, he was not capable of becoming a pope, according to a lot of people. Now, is there any proof he was a Freemason? No, it's pretty much just hearsay. Slavery is not immoral. The idea of slavery being not immoral is one of the most controversial topics within Christianity in general, and of course within Catholicism. The permissibility of slavery is heavily debated, and through the primary period of the slave trade in the, you could say, the Atlantic Triangle, the slave trade in the New World, you have a lot of controversy there if you look back historically, because it was never really clearly condemned by popes at the time. So it could be argued that at least certain forms of slavery are valid or permissible. This is a really complex topic. I don't talk about it that much, and it doesn't really come up that much within the Traditionalist Catholic movement. But it is worth pointing out that slavery is never really condemned throughout the New Testament and within the Bible at large. Conclavism. Conclavism is the idea within Sedevacantism that since the See of St. Peter, the seat of St. Peter, and the Episcopal See of Rome, the Pope in his office, are vacant, that the Church is under an obligation to fulfill it again. And so there are various conclavists that are trying to, within the Sedevacantist movement, to elect another Pope to continue where the Church left off since Vatican II. Of course, this is not an easy thing to do. We already talked about the Great Western Schism, and what to do when there's multiple popes that claim to be the Pope at the same time, or trying to make up a Pope from a council of bishops. It generally kind of fails. And so all these goals throughout history to try and create another Pope end up with these claimants to the papacy which have no followers. Also, there's the problem because before, according to Sedevacantists, the papacy went extinct, the cardinalate also would have went extinct. And so before that happened, the legislation was that a pope had to be elected by the College of Cardinals. Well, there's no way to make another College of Cardinals because none of the cardinals became Sedevacantist. All the cardinals under Pius XII are extinct. And so Sedevacantist clergy and Sedevacantist laity really have no place to elect a pope. Now, some of them will say there needs to be an imperfect council of Sedevacantist bishops, and like the councils that ended the Great Western Schism, they will elect a pope, and that pope will become the Pope of the Sedevacantists, and he'll be recognized as the one Pope and unify Sedevacantism and be able to kind of clear up the controversies within Sedevacantism and, in their minds, set about continuing the Catholic Church where Pius XII left off. There are also conclavists who believe that they have been chosen by God to be the Pope, and we'll get to some of them as we get further down in this iceberg. Next up, we have the bogus Ordo Church. This is another slur or pejorative way to say the regular Catholic Church after Vatican II. But instead of saying Novus Ordo, you say bogus Ordo because it rhymes with Novus. Agatha Christi saved the Latin Mass. Agatha Christi was one of the most important English authors of the 20th century. She was quite prolific and wrote numerous books, mystery books that is, or detective novels. And they're really popular, and they have a rabid cult following throughout the world. She was, of course, English, and she was an Anglican, but she had a great respect for the Catholic Church and had many Catholic friends. So she actually wrote a personal letter to Paul VI, pleading with him not to ban the Latin Mass. And so Paul VI is supposed to have said in excitement, Agatha Christi, and because of her influence and her fame, she was able to prevent the Latin Mass from being banned worldwide. at least within the single country of Britain. And so the indult within Britain went by the nickname Agatha Christi Indult. Of course, as we talked a little bit earlier, the worldwide indult for the Latin Mass would be set up in 1984. So basically, the only way that you could legally get the Latin Mass is through the Agatha Christi Indult between 1971 and 1984, and it would have been banned anywhere else throughout the world. The for all and the for many controversy. And so in the canon of the Mass, or in the Eucharistic prayer, there is for many, that this may be done for many. So when the Novus Ordo came out in many languages, this was translated as for all, because this was such an important part of the sacrament of the Eucharist. A lot of Sedevacantists said that the translation for all from for many in the Latin invalidates the sacrament. In English, at least, this was retranslated to for many in the 2011 liturgical reforms. Post-traditionalism. Post-traditionalism is kind of a meme term. It's when somebody who was traditionalist, maybe radicalized in traditionalism on the internet, abandons that and then kind of moves towards the beginning of our iceberg here into more mainstream positions. Sometimes they'll be actively anti-traditionalist, and they may fall into the Pope-splainer category. Slaves of the Immaculate Heart, or Slaves of the Immaculate Heart of Mary. This is the group started by Father Leonard Feeney, and it is connected, of course, also to the St. Benedict Center. They promoted Feeneyism and traditional Catholicism. Sister Catherine, a nun, was also one of the co-founders there. It's set up in the northeast of the country, in Harvard, Massachusetts. And with that, we complete Tier 7, and we will now move on to Tier 8 of the traditional Catholic iceberg. Okay, so the first part of Tier 8 is the Novus Ordo legally is the Roman Rite. And I don't know what else to say other than that's the truth. A lot of Sedevacantists or more radical elements of the Society of St. Pius X will say things like the Novus Ordo is a new rite or it's schismatic. The reality is the Novus Ordo, the reforms that have been done under Paul VI are radical. It's still, legally speaking, is the Latin Mass. It is the rite of the Western Church under the Pope as its patriarch. It is the same rite as the Missal of 1967, is the same rite of the Missal of 1954. It's the same rite as the Roman Mass put out with Col Primum. It is the legal Roman rite of the Catholic Church. Next up, we have the Robber Church. Now, this is actually the collection of the writings of Patrick Henry Omlor. I think Omlor. It's Omlor, so I don't know if I'm mispronouncing it. He was one of the earliest Sedevacantists. He first started writing in, I believe, 1968, so very, very early on. A lot of people that are deeper into Sedevacantism than me and know a lot about its history know that a lot of the arguments of Sedevacantism begin here in the Robber Church. It's just interesting that all these arguments of Sedevacantism are buried in obscure and out-of-print books that are out of reach for the laity and probably unknown to theologians or apologists. To most people, what you get on the internet is what you get. They're not even aware that there's all these books that were published in the 1970s that are putting Sedevacantism forward as a thesis and having arguments bulwarking it. Inner Feniite schisms. Now, I don't know how many people are aware of this or know the background of the Slaves of the Immaculate Heart of Mary, but apparently after Sister Catherine's death in 1968, the Slaves of the Immaculate Heart of Mary split into three groups: the St. Benedict Abbey, the Sisters of the St. Benedict Center, the Slaves of the Immaculate Heart of Mary, St. Anne's House version, and the Slaves of the Immaculate Heart of Mary of the St. Benedict Center. And that last one broke off in the mid-1980s, and it exists in New Hampshire. Stephen Heiner. Stephen Heiner is currently a lay helper for the Most Holy Trinity Seminary, which is, of course, under Bishop Donald Sanborn. He was the founder of True Restoration, which was a very slick Sedevacantist apostolate, which kind of came out around the end of Benedict XVI's reign and the beginning of Francis's reign. And I think just how slick True Restoration was when it came out, and how it kind of had a lot of clerics there, Bishop Dolan, Bishop Sanborn, Father Shikata, who were articulate and well-read. It really kind of gave Sedevacantism legitimacy that it hadn't really seen before. And I think that at that time, when Francis first became Pope, and later really kind of solidified Sedevacantism as a valid option in a lot of people's eyes. And I'm just speaking out of public experience because that was definitely the case for me, and was very influential when I had that Sedevacantist phase. Garage and hotel masses. So this was something that would come up very early in the Traditionalist Catholic movement, when there would be these independent priests who would get kicked out by their bishop. They would end up having a circuit of masses that they would go through town to town and offer the Latin Mass to small groups of the faithful. They didn't really have any money, so they weren't able to buy, say, an abandoned church, whether or not Catholic or Protestant. Probably more likely Protestant in a lot of these cases. So very early on, they would have masses, Latin masses, in garages or in hotels. So it was kind of ironic, because the Latin Mass is viewed as this really gaudy high church thing to Protestants and critics of the church. But it was the Novus Ordo that's getting celebrated in all these historic churches, and the Latin Mass was getting celebrated in garages and hotels. Now, I believe there's still some garages and hotel masses, but a lot of these independent priests, a lot of them have aged out. The Society of St. Pius X has become established, and they all have churches. And Sedevacantism, although it started there, and there's still Sedevacantist groups that are like that, they, over time, have had a laity, and they've grown in the laity that have been able to offer donations to them, and now Sedevacantists usually have churches. Whether they're buying old Catholic churches or they're refurbishing Protestant churches, but Sedevacantists now usually have churches. Cessationism. Sedevacantism is cessationist. And now this is probably a little bit of a slander, but in my opinion, a lot of Sedevacantists act like cessationism has happened. At least since Vatican II, they say, well, this is no longer an age of miracles. And this is something I brought up to Sedevacantists before, is that, well, if you're the small minority, if the Catholic Church isn't really 1 billion people, and it's just a small minority of tens of thousands, maybe at max 100,000 people, wouldn't that small minority be a miracle magnet? Wouldn't it be full of the greatest saints in the history of the Church, as it was when the Church was so pure at the beginning of the Church? And in those first few centuries before Constantine, you see all those saints and martyrs and everything, just a very pure church. When this small Sedevacantist church that's besieged, wouldn't it be full of great saints to help guide the faithful? And then the Sedevacantists will usually point back, oh, it's been prophesied that cessationism will happen. And then somebody who's more, say, follows, I guess, the regular church like me, well, they'll be like, well, look at all these miracles and clear saints after the council, and they'll be like, haha, they aren't saints. Cessationism. And I probably just jumped over cessationism's definition for a little bit, so I'm going to steal Wikipedia's here. Cessationism is the doctrine that spiritual gifts such as speaking in tongues, prophecy, and healing have ceased with the apostolic age. Basically, miracles don't happen after the Bible. This is more of a Calvinist, or more of the more hardcore Protestant reformers believe in this. And it's interesting because virtually Sedevacantists are cessationists. Latinization was actually a good thing. And so Latinization was the policy of imposing the standards liturgically from the Western Rite onto the Eastern Rite churches in communion with Rome. Latinization took place after the Eastern Rite started to reunite with Rome in, I guess you could call it the early modern period, but Leo XIII started trying to push against this, and Vatican II pushed against it more strongly, stressing that the Eastern Rites need to be proud of their identity and their history and maintain their uniqueness over and against the larger Western Rite Church of the total churches that are currently in communion with the Vatican. There are some traditionalists who support Latinization or want a return to Latinization to the Eastern Rites, and there are actually some in the Eastern Rites that want the same as well, that are, I guess, associated with traditionalism. Father Luigi Villa. Father Luigi Villa is an Italian traditionalist writer. His most famous book is Paul VI Beatified, ? And I believe he also wrote John Paul II Beatified, Never. I don't know that much about him. There's actually a biography about him that's pretty lengthy, so I wasn't able to come up with that much about him, other than he had those books that criticized those two popes, which now have not only been beatified, but made saints. He also apparently knew Padre Pio. There are 20 living anti-popes. I don't know where it comes from. It's some quote that I keep seeing as this copy pasta. There are 20 living anti-popes. There are 20 living anti-popes. Or there are 30 living anti-popes. Or something like that. Always, there are this many living anti-popes. And of course, that quote is always in context of conclavism. And indeed, I talk about a few conclavist claimants to the papal throne throughout this. There's a whole bunch of obscure anti-popes that nobody knows about, that were smaller than, say, Pope Michael, that nobody knows about, that they're just off there somewhere, just some obscure place in Africa. There's just some guy that never had holy orders that just calls himself the Pope. And a lot of these people, I don't even know if they're necessarily traditionalist conclavists. They're just claiming to be the Pope. It's interesting. It's bizarre. Clement XIV was right. Clement XIV was the Pope that suppressed the Jesuits. So obviously, this means that the Jesuits should have kept being suppressed. It's believed that, historically at least, that Clement XIV did so because a lot of the European monarchies, which were tending towards Gallicanism, so-called Josephism after Joseph II of Austria, or Jansenism, really hated the Jesuits and wanted them repealed, and that's what happened, of course. There were two states that were not Catholic that refused to allow the Jesuits to be abolished and continue them on until they were reinstituted. And then once the Jesuits were reinstituted, they again were pretty, small old Orthodox, a good order. But as we all know, following World War II, the Jesuits went off the deep end and became super liberal. So the idea is basically they should have just stayed banned the whole time. Okay, next up we have 2 Thessalonians 2:18-12. This is usually the cessationist quote or Bible quote that a lot of Sedevacantists post at me when I talk about Sedevacantists having a lot less miracles than the mainstream Catholic Church. So anyway, I'm going to read from the Douay Rheims version. And then that wicked one shall be revealed, whom the Lord Jesus shall kill with the spirit of his mouth, and shall destroy with the brightness of his coming. Him, whose coming is according to the working of Satan, in all power and signs and lying wonders, and in all seduction of iniquity, to them that perish, because they receive not the love of the truth, that they might be saved. Therefore God shall send them the operation of error to believe lying, that all may be judged who have been believed in the truth, but have consented to iniquity. But we ought to give thanks to God always for you, brethren, beloved of God, for that God hath chosen you first fruits unto salvation and sanctification of the Spirit and faith of the truth. So basically it's saying that in the end times there'll be miracles that are caused by Satan. And so when I point to Eucharistic miracles, these people just say, well, that's created by Satan. Pius XII was a bad pope. Let's think about this hard for a second, right? If Pius XII was the last pope, and the next pope was John the 23rd, and John the 23rd was an antichrist, and he reigned for a short time, did Vatican II, then Paul VI, he's also an antichrist. I'm literally saying antichrist on accident, but, you know, John the 23rd, Paul VI, anti-popes, but Pius XII, he was a real pope, but the last one. If Pius XII was the last pope, and he didn't try to prevent this whole anti-pope Sedevacantism thing from happening, and he put all those cardinals in place that blew up the church, then doesn't that mean that Pius XII would be the worst pope in history? Wouldn't he be the most disgusting and terrible pope if he was the last pope and didn't try to prevent Sedevacantism from happening? Another thing is that even if you're not a Sedevacantist, but you're just kind of a traditionalist who's going to believe that Paul VI on and those popes on are true popes, a lot of those innovations that began under John the 23rd and Paul VI, you can point to Pius XII doing those innovations as well. So John Paul I wasn't crowned, he inaugurated himself like he was a Republican leader. Well, Pius XII abolished the Roman nobility. I've talked a lot about the whole 1962 versus 1952 missal thing. Well, Pius XII is the one that started the changes to Holy Week, which ultimately led to the Novus Ordo Missal. And I already talked about Pius XII's changes to the way that we translated the Bible, and that he opened the door and basically allowed for higher criticism to go into the church, to go into the seminary. I know that I made it a meme so far of, haha, Catholics don't read the Bible and all those stupid Protestant memes. But it is really serious. If you undermine the Word of God with this higher criticism garbage, you're going to undermine the faith of the faithful. And when it's being taught in the seminaries, that's going to undermine the priests and eventually the bishops and their faith. Divine Fiat Spiritu, 1943, that is as bad as any of the documents of Vatican II in allowing the faith to be undermined in a very ambiguous manner through lackadaisical legislation. Saint Joseph does not belong in the Roman canon. During the papacy of John the 23rd and in the Missal of 1962, Saint Joseph was inserted into the Roman canon. Saint Joseph obviously was not in the Roman canon. The Roman canon is so ancient that it literally goes before recorded history with the church, and it's all these obscure martyrs that are in it. And it's all martyrs, and it's Mary, the Queen of Martyrs. And so he inserts Saint Joseph, who isn't a martyr. And this in and of itself, in the minds of more liturgically literate traditionalists, is a scandal and is just as bad as facing the people or communion on the hand. Archbishop Lefebvre's orders are invalid. This is a very weird one. I don't know who's really pushing it, but there's this idea that the consecrator of Archbishop Lefebvre and his ordainers, they weren't traditionalist or I guess small O Orthodox, and so they that would taint them in some kind of Donatistic fashion and make the holy orders wrong, and that he never received holy orders, so the Society of St. Pius X priests aren't real priests. It's this weird thing that goes around. It's odd, but I've heard it before. Next up, we have a typo. Early Karl Ratzinger is heretical. That's obviously supposed to be early Joseph Ratzinger is heretical. That meaning, of course, the man that would become Benedict XVI. Before he became Benedict XVI, a lot of traditionalists would say he's heretical and it's terrible that he's in charge of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, and then he became Pope, and to them that only made it worse. He was, of course, a Novile theologian before he became the head of the doctrine of the Congregation of the Faith. Ironically, even though all these radical traditionalists are saying this, he was the scourge of the liberals and modernists, right? He was John Paul II's Rottweiler, Ratzinger the Rottweiler. Next up, we have Sedevacantism. Sedevacantism is an interesting thing. It's one of these guys on CAF Info, and I don't remember his name, came up with the term. But Sedevacantism is basically, because we don't have any way to say that Sedevacantism is true, we as lay people or even priests or arguably even bishops don't have the authority to depope a pope or say that he's lost his throne. Well, we're just up in this kind of limbo area where a pope is saying heresy. So we're doubting that he's the pope, but we can't actually say he's not the pope. And so you're Sedevadoutist. From my understanding, I guess the Society of St. Pius V doesn't have any hard rules on whether or not it's Sedevacantist or doubt. So that means it's technically like Sedevadoutist, because the question of if Francis is the real pope isn't been formally like declared, or it can't be formally declared, so they're not Sedevacantist necessarily, but they're really Sedevadoutist. I don't know, it's interesting. CAF Info. CAF Info is a forum board. There's all these forums for discussion, and it's managed by people that are pro Society of St. Pius X resistance, but there's Society of St. Pius X people there, and there's Sedevacantists there. But the most interesting board of all, of course, is the Crisis in the Church board. And this is just wall-to-wall flame wars between Sedevacantists and SSPX, and just debates about the most obscure stuff. This is where most of the info on this whole iceberg even comes from, is just learning about the backstory of a lot of traditionalist groups and a lot of Sedevacantist groups, how Sedevacantists came up with their ideas, and so on. One of my favorite things about the whole CAF Info thing, and especially about the whole Crisis in the Church board, is that within the Crisis of the Church board, there's this thing called the Feniism ghetto, or a child board. So basically, if any Feniite tries to, deny baptism of desire, or deny baptism of blood, or so on, they literally get just kicked out. And basically, there is a child board, right? It's exclusively for Feniites to go on. And so I remember posting on here, and then all of a sudden, Feniites would come out of nowhere, and it would be something about, like, oh, I'm asking about Society of St. Pius V, and about, oh, how are their priests, or how do they do the Mass, or something like that, right? Some kind of, like, question about Sedevacantism. And then, like, all of a sudden, Feniites jump out of the bushes and are like, well, the Society of St. Pius V, they aren't true Catholics because they believe in a baptism of desire. And then it's like they just jump out on every thread. It could be about anything. Like, it could be like, a homeschooling mother talking about different homeschooling curriculums. All of a sudden, they jump out of the woodwork, right? And they're like, you're not a real Catholic because you believe in baptism of desire. And so they're getting banned, and it's like this weird thing. There's like this guerrilla resistance of all these Feniites just attacking everybody and starting problems and conflict, and the mods are always trying to ban it, and they're like sneaking in. It's the most hilarious thing. Sports are adultery. This is something that kind of came from Bishop Dolan, that I would see a lot of the times on True Restoration, that he would always harp on about how sports are idolatry, and sports are like the new paganism. And I mean, it's definitely not good that sports, like Sunday, that like somebody won't go to church because they're so obsessed with football. And I don't like sports. I mean, I'm probably, as you could tell, a pretty bookish guy. But I don't know. I always considered just how extreme he was about sports being adultery and comparing it to like football is just like gladiatorial games and is a blood sport, and that kind of like thinking is odd because sports, I mean, it's good to be healthy. Competition is good for boys, at least. It's good that it inspires health. Now I understand that there was the Olympics in pagan Greece, and there was the gladiatorial games, and there was the chariots in the Roman times and ancient Greece and stuff. And I understand like that's associated with the pagan world, but if you don't take it too far, sports are good because they promote good health. Next up, we have La Nova Iglesia Montana. So this is a 1970 book by the priest Joaquin Sanez y Allega. My Spanish isn't that well. I did take some Spanish in college, so I'm a lot better in Spanish than I am in Latin or French or Italian. But he was a Sedevacantist Mexican priest, and La Nova Iglesia Montana, that is the new church of Montini, or Montini's new church. Of course, that's the surname of Paul VI. So basically, Paul VI's new church. In it, he pushes forward Sedevacantism. I think he might have been one of the first people to use the term Sedevacantism, because apparently his next book in 1973, Sedevacante, Paul VI no es Papa Legimo, Paul VI is not a legitimate pope, Sedevacantist. So he was definitely one of the earliest Sedevacantist priests and writers and theologians. He would end up being one of the founders of Trento. He died before the priests in Trento would be consecrated bishops by Archbishop Thuc, but he definitely left a mark. Now, even though his books have not been translated out of Spanish into English, I think that he is definitely one of the real founders of Sedevacantism. And this is something I talked about in the very first video I did, about how it's really hard for me to know how spread out Sedevacantism is in Mexico, is in Latin America, because it seems with Arriaga is that Sedevacantism really had a pretty big beginning in Mexico. And so I can't tell how big it is because I did some very, very basic Spanish, but I don't know how big it and how far it's spread. So it seems kind of like it's an American thing that may have crossed over from Trento, and for whatever reason Trento kind of stagnated or puttered in place and it took off in America. But that might not be true. Sedevacantism might be bigger in Latin America, or just as big as Latin America as it is in Anglo-America. I just have a language barrier and I can't tell. And the second trend that's interesting there is that Sedevacantism, as it was purported as a theological theory, really had a lot of books and articles that were published early on in the 70s, and people that debate Sedevacantism don't really know that, right? People are just debating against, whatever the Diamond Brothers or whatever the late Father Shikata said in a YouTube video, but sometimes maybe they'll read Father Shikata's articles he put online. But before Father Shikata was even ordained, there were Sedevacantist books that were running around, and I feel like a lot more research against Sedevacantism has to be based around the writings of Arriaga or the writings of Omlar. Next up, we have Mel Gibson's dad. Now, it's funnier to say Mel Gibson's dad because it was always written in the anti-Mel Gibson stuff after the Passion of the Christ. Mel Gibson's dad, the extremist. But Hutton Gibson is an interesting character, right? And he was a Sedevacantist. And he wrote Sedevacantist books not as early as the other two, but he definitely was an early Sedevacantist with Is the Pope Catholic? Paul VI's Legacy, Catholicism, which came out in 1978. He just had a really long and storied career. He also toyed with the idea of the Siri hypothesis. He was a questioner of certain narratives in World War II. He just had a long career of interesting things. I think he fled to Australia at one point, and that Mel Gibson and a lot of his siblings, that's how they ended up in Australia, and that there was some kind of, like, compound, if you will, for a while. He also was a Jeopardy champion. He had 11 kids, and he lived to the age of 101. Just a really interesting character. And of course, this kind of radical Sedevacantist faith imprinted upon Mel Gibson, who would grow up to make the most influential and popular Christian movie of all time, The Passion of the Christ. Next up, we have Archbishop Lefebvre is a saint. Now, obviously, he hasn't been canonized, but I feel that there is a feeling or a mood within the Society of St. Pius X and people that are sympathetic to the Society of St. Pius X, and they feel that Archbishop Lefebvre really is a saint. And you see a lot of things like pictures of Lefebvre being posted in home altars, and you just get the sense that he's growing a cult in a very organic way in which saints of the past definitely would have. Maurice Pinay. Now, I don't know that much about him. I just ended up getting him put into a list of people that I should include in this iceberg. And to be honest, I'm sorry I don't know that much about him. Basically, he wrote The Plot Against the Church was written at about the time Vatican II came out, and he said that there's an international Jewish conspiracy to undermine the Catholic Church. And so basically he's an edgelord, and it's interesting because I typed his name in, and you can get this anti-Jewish book off Barnes & Noble's. So that's interesting. Barnes & Noble's definitely way more free speech than Amazon. Now we have the granddaddy of them all, the question of the validity of the Thuc orders. I wrote it down as validity of Thuc holy orders, ? So Archbishop Thuc, I already talked about him. The majority of Sedevacantist holy orders, as well as Palmarian holy orders, descend from Archbishop Thuc. Archbishop Thuc was an archbishop of Hue City who ended up in exile after Vatican II and after his brother, who was president of the country, was executed, and ultimately after the communists took over Vietnam. So he was exiled in Europe and eventually into the United States, and very late into his life, I believe in his 80s, he would consecrate 10 people as bishops in kind of like haphazard fashion. I think it was, maybe it was the Mad Monarchist actually that said this. He would consecrate anybody who had a pulse. And because of the scandal that surrounded the whole Palmarian cult, which we'll get to a little bit later, and because he consecrated these old Catholics who said, I want to become a real Catholic priest, and he said, okay, and he consecrated them, and because he allegedly gave up on being a Sedevacantist, he was supposed to be the only bishop who became a Sedevacantist, right, that was connected to the church, that formally became a Sedevacantist. Well, he made a statement of Sedevacantism, and then apparently he retracted it and then died fully reconciled with Rome. And so that's a really big egg on the face of Sedevacantism. And so there's always this question of why did he do this? Was he mental? Was he having dementia? Is this simony? Basically, sometimes I've actually described it as like friend simony. Was he just completely isolated in Europe and basically Traditionalist met up with him and became friends with him, and so he consecrated them out of friendship? It's just kind of an odd thing, and because of the question of him having dementia, that leads into this idea that his orders are invalid. And so that's a question that's also divided the Sedevacantist movement, is that the majority of Sedevacantists have orders that come from Archbishop Thuc, but the Society of St. Pius V, for all intents and purposes, is a Sedevacantist group, but they will have nothing to do with any Thuc groups. And they consider the Thuc groups, which are mainstream Sedevacantists, just as mainstream as the Society of St. Pius V within Sedevacantism, as like Thucite, non-Catholic cults. And it's bizarre. The Society of St. Pius V makes you basically completely act like you've left Christianity for Islam or something, and that you have to do, if you just went to a CMRI or a priest that was ordained by Dolan or Sanborn, you're supposed to have like a full confession of every sin you've ever done in life and possibly rebaptized. Father Shikata basically called their position the idea of Episcopal cooties. Interestingly, it seems that the mainstream Catholic Church accepts Thuc orders. They don't reordain Sedevacantist priests that go back to the mainstream church. I think that, I don't know the guy's name, but there was an example of a Sedevacantist or reordained old Catholic priest that ended up being ordained within a normal Catholic diocese, and he didn't have to be reordained. And so the Vatican believes that they're valid holy orders, and I think the Society of St. Pius X does as well. Imperfect council. Imperfect council is a conclavist idea. Basically, the idea is that you gather a lot of Sedevacantist clerics, and then from amongst themselves they will form an imperfect council. They can't be a conclave, a papal conclave, but they will act as this imperfect council, a council of the church, and they will be able to elect a new pope from themselves. Now, this has been tried to a certain extent, most notably with Pope Michael and Pope Pius XIII, and of course they didn't turn out. They were conclavist popes that never gained any real following. Next up we have Douay-Rheims onlyism. So Douay-Rheims onlyism, I think it's usually a traditionalist Catholic joke against King James onlyism. But basically it's the same idea as the King James onlyist. The Douay-Rheims is not only the best Catholic translation of the Bible into English, but it ought to be the only one that you use, and everything else is inferior, and we should all stick to the Douay-Rheims. Failed Diamond Brothers prophecies. The Diamond Brothers have a lot of videos, some of which are available to mainstream normie Catholics that talk about stuff like exorcisms, or are good for brainy Catholics or traditionalists when they debate justification with Protestants or debate the papacy with Eastern Orthodox. But a lot of the Diamond Brothers content has to do with very obscure prophecies based on the Book of Revelation, and very bizarre readings of the Book of Revelation, stuff like seeing all the Vatican II priests or popes as like the seven kings, but they don't, it's not all the Vatican II popes. It actually starts out with the Lateran Treaty, and so some of them are supposed to be real popes. And just really odd prophecies which always fail, and I have two particular ones here that I'm going to get to later of their prophecies. There's a whole documentary about the Diamond Brothers which I wish would get finished. It's very, very good. It talks about their bizarre prophecies. It's called Shine On You Crazy Diamond, and it's on YouTube, and of course the title is inspired by the Pink Floyd song. Dr. Rama Karum Swami. Rama Kusuru... I'm going to mispronounce his name. He's of Indian descent, and I'm going to butcher his name. Dr. Rama Kum Asrami. He was a early Sedevacantist writer, which is now very obscure that people don't talk about. Like a lot of the other early Sedevacantist writers I've talked about so far that have been through this tier, he wrote The Destruction of Christian Tradition and the Post-Conciliar Rite of Holy Orders, and he argued that, of course, the 1968 Rite of Holy Orders was invalid. His father actually was a perennialist or traditionalist Hindu writer, Andhra Kumsarami, so he ended up converting Catholicism and then taught at the Society of St. Pius X's St. Thomas Aquinas Seminary early on, but then left it and became a Sedevacantist. I've heard that he was actually ended up having either old Catholic orders or maybe even took orders, and he was married though and had 6 kids. Interesting, and it just kind of goes into the whole kind of underworld of old Catholic orders or independent Catholic orders. But maybe that's a slander. Again, that's just a rumor that he did that. Bishop Schuckart, I've already talked about him, I believe, in the CMRI video. He was the founder of the CMRI, but eventually he would be kicked out of that group in scandal. A lot of anti-CMRI people try to say he was a classic cult leader, very demanding, very controlling, and that he apparently secretly thought about himself as a pope. Very scandalous in that he, again, is somebody who took old Catholic or independent Catholic orders, and this was very early on into the whole Vatican II traditionalist thing. I think that he was anti-Vatican II before the new Mass even came out, because he was part of the Blue Army of the Rosary and was kicked out of that. But he ended up having old Catholic orders and started ordaining these priests for the CMRI into the old Catholic orders. He had very poor health, and he was in a wheelchair, and people on the outside of the CMRI accuse him of leading a classic, 1970s cult, domineering, egotistical, make up the rules as you go along. The classic Jim Jones, Charles Manson, Scientology, Mooney type of cult that was going on at that period that the CMRI was founded, except for, of course, they're traditionalist Catholics, and he's said to have declared himself a pope, but only said to some people he's a pope and not to others, and numerous people said he never said that. And when you ask CMRI priests that were around back then, they're like, well, it was a mistake that we used these old Catholic orders, or I never knew that they're old Catholic, I thought he had mainstream Catholic orders. And they usually say that it wasn't a cult, and they say that he was a very reclusive man, and that it was in fact the opposite, that he wasn't, of him being controlling, that he was reclusive and he wasn't able to do the duties of being a bishop. Just a very interesting character. Society of St. Pius V and their grudge with the CMRI make him out into, of course, being the Jim Jones type of person. He was accused of having sex with some underage seminarians, so that's no good. And he was accused of money laundering and funneling large amounts of cash. He ran away to Greensville, California, where there was a small group of followers, and apparently he was raided in 1987 by local SWAT team there, and I heard he went to prison, but I can't find any concrete data on him going to prison or not. Neo-counselorism. This is an interesting idea. This has to do a little bit with the whole Honorius being deposed via a council of bishops, so perhaps in the future there'll be a council of bishops that deposes Pope Francis. Counselarism, of course, is the idea that the highest level of legislative authority, and indeed the highest level of authority in the church, is not the papacy, but actively a council. And ironically enough, a council condemned counselarism, right? Vatican I, and it declared papal infallibility in Vatican I, so the Pope used a council to destroy counselarism as this heresy. But neo-counselarism, that has to do with the whole synodal way, that's going on right now in the establishment of synodality after Vatican II, that there's this idea that Vatican II is calling for a neo-councelarism. Some of the more liberal spirit of Vatican II people actively will say that Vatican II is pushing councelarism over the top of Vatican I and over and against Vatican I. And then there's this whole other idea about neo-councelarism as being a possible right-wing thing against, Pope Francis being this liberal pope, or maybe a turn away towards old Catholics, which, because they left in the wake of Vatican I, were councilarist, even though they lost a council completely overwhelmingly in Vatican I. So basically, just a whole bunch of things. The idea of the liberals saying that Vatican II brings back councilarism and that's a good thing, or the idea of some really radical traditionalist who's trying to dig up councilarism for whatever that's worth over and against Pope Francis and thinking that Vatican I was a mistake. Finally, we have the 1969 Missal, or the first Novus Ordo Missal, right? Presumes ad orientem. And if you read through the Missal, it talks about the priest turning around, which means that it assumes that there's ad orientem. And that means a lot, because the priest facing the people is a liturgical abuse. And even within the document of the 1969 Missal, it's a liturgical abuse. This kind of connects with other things I put on the iceberg about the changes in the new Mass are not what was called for at Vatican II, or more of reform of the reform stuff. But that ends Tier 8 of this iceberg. Thanks so much for watching this far. Sorry I'm a stuttering idiot, and sorry that I mispronounce everything. Please pray for me and pray for the church.